I heard the door close before I heard my daughter breathe. The sound was soft, almost polite, like someone trying not to disturb a house that had already decided not to notice them. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a cup I did not remember pouring, when the quiet settled in a way that told me something had shifted. She had come back after 3 days, not to argue, not to defend herself, just to say she was sorry. And when the door shut again, I understood that an apology, if it does not arrive in the right shape, can be treated like silence. I did not move. I did not call out. I stood where I was and listened to the house continue without her. People think a home always knows who belongs in it. I learned that day that a home can be taught to forget. My daughter had grown up in those rooms. Her height was still marked on the wall by the pantry. The corner of the sofa still dipped the way it always had when she sat there doing homework, knees tucked up, hair falling into her eyes. But when she knocked that afternoon, the house did not lean toward her. It did not open itself. It waited for a better performance, a fuller apology, something louder than the quiet she carried with her. I had watched the argument 3 days earlier from the hallway. I did not step in. That is the truth I carry, and I do not dress it up. It was loud, then sharp, then cold. Words landed where they meant to. When he told her to leave, he said it as though it were temporary, as though space itself would correct her. When she left, she did not slam the door. She picked up her jacket and her keys and walked past me without looking up. I told myself she would cool off. I told myself she would be back by morning. Mothers tell themselves many things because believing them feels like doing something. Those 3 days stretched longer than they should have. I slept with my phone beside me, volume high, the screen lighting up the ceiling every time I shifted. I imagined her sitting on a friend's couch, laughing too loudly to hide the discomfort. I imagined her saying she was fine. I imagined her saying nothing at all. When she came back, she looked smaller. Not thinner, not weaker, just quieter, as if she had folded herself inward to fit whatever space was left for her. She knocked once. When the door opened, she said, "I'm sorry." Her voice did not tremble. It did not plead. It sounded like something carefully prepared, practiced alone. I could see her through the doorway, standing straight, hands empty. I waited for the rest of it. So did he. When he told her it was not good enough, he said it calmly, as though he were correcting a child on table manners. Then the door closed. I remember thinking it closed too easily. After that, the days rearranged themselves. Her room stayed untouched for a while, the bed made, the window cracked just enough for air. I would pause outside it, listening for sounds that no longer came. Eventually, I began to close the door, not because I wanted to forget, but because keeping it open felt like insisting on a presence that had been denied. The house accepted the change quickly. Houses are practical that way. She did not come back again, not that week, not that month. I heard pieces of her life from others, never directly from her. She was staying here, then there, working small jobs, keeping busy. I told myself she was learning independence. That word is a comfort people use when they do not want to say abandonment. When she told me she had joined the military, she said it plainly, without drama. I remember nodding, as if this were an ordinary next step, as if young women often leave home this way when doors do not open for them. Time moved the way it always does, whether you are ready or not. Years passed. Birthdays were acknowledged with short calls. Holidays arrived quietly. I watched other people's children come and go, settle nearby, bring grandchildren by on weekends. My daughter's life happened somewhere else. She sent photos occasionally, new places, new uniforms. Her smile was always careful, like something worn for the camera. We saw each other only a few times. We spoke about work, about weather, about anything that did not reach backward. The past sat between us like a piece of furniture no one wanted to move. He sent money for birthdays, for Christmas. Sometimes he added notes that were too cheerful, as if brightness could substitute for words that had never been said. When my daughter had a child of her own, he sent envelopes then, too. Once he wrote the wrong name. I noticed before she did. I did not correct nothing. I did not know how to explain that mistakes like that do not happen by accident, but they are rarely intentional either. They live in the space where relationships thin out. I tell myself I'm an observer now, that my role is to notice without interfering, but the truth is I still listen for footsteps that do not come. I still remember the sound of the door closing, how final it felt without announcing itself. My daughter has built a life that holds together without us. I am proud of her in ways I do not say out loud. And yet, when I think of that afternoon, of her standing there with a single sentence prepared, I wonder how many lives are redirected by moments that are treated as small. I wonder what would have happened if the door had stayed open just a little longer.
Loneliness does not arrive all at once. It settles in slowly, the way dust does, thin enough at first that you tell yourself it will not matter. After my daughter left, the house felt larger but not emptier. There was still noise, still routine. Meals were cooked, lights were turned off at night, conversations happened that did not include her name. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like, that children leave and mothers adjust. But adjustment is not the same as acceptance, and I found myself noticing the quiet places more than the loud ones. Her chair stayed empty at the table, and no one mentioned it because mentioning it would have required an explanation none of us were prepared to give. I began to measure time differently. Before, I counted days by ordinary things, grocery lists, errands, small plans. After she left, I counted by absences. The first holiday she did not come home. The first birthday I celebrated without hearing her voice in the same room. The first winter when I realized I no longer knew where she kept her coat. Each absence stacked on the last, not heavy enough to crush me, but persistent enough to change my posture. I stood straighter around others and bent inward when alone. When she called, her voice sounded far away even when the line was clear. She spoke carefully, as if conversation were a surface that might crack if stepped on too firmly. I learned to match her tone. We talked about safe things, work, weather, how quickly time was moving. We did not talk about the day she came back to the door. Silence became our shared language, practiced and efficient. It allowed us to remain connected without reopening something neither of us knew how to close properly. I watched her life unfold in fragments, a change of address here, a new job title there, photos that showed her standing beside people whose names I did not know. She looked capable, organized, like someone who had learned early not to rely on the idea of home. I told myself this was a strength she might not have developed otherwise, and the thought comforted me for a while. Mothers are skilled at turning pain into lessons because lessons feel purposeful. Pain alone feels wasted. The man I lived with tried, in his own way, to behave as though nothing permanent had happened. He spoke of her as if she were simply busy, temporarily distant. When he sent money, he did it with a sense of completion, as if generosity could stand in for conversation. I watched him write checks, seal envelopes, place stamps with care. There was relief in his movements, the kind people feel when they believe they have done their part. I did not interrupt. I was not sure what interrupting would change. As the years passed, I noticed something subtle shifting in myself. I stopped anticipating her return. Not consciously, not deliberately. I just stopped arranging my thoughts around the idea that she might come through the door unexpectedly. The house rearranged itself again. Her room became storage. The height marks on the wall were painted over. I kept one photo of her as a child tucked in a drawer, not displayed, not hidden, just placed where I could reach it when I needed to remind myself that memory still existed, even if it was no longer visible. When she told me she had joined the military, I felt two emotions at once, pride and grief, arriving together and refusing to separate. Pride because she sounded steady, certain. Grief because certainty should not have been her only option. I congratulated her. I said I was proud. I did not say I was sorry. I did not say I was afraid. I did not say that I understood this decision as a kind of exile disguised as service. Mothers often mistake restraint for strength, and I was no different. The years she spent away stretched long, then longer. I attended weddings without her, held new babies that would not know her voice. I smiled for photographs and sent copies to her, hoping she would recognize herself as still belonging somewhere in them. She always replied politely. She always said she was happy for us. The words did not carry weight. They floated, untethered, and I learned not to press them down with expectations. When she had a child of her own, something in me loosened, not healed, loosened. I thought perhaps time had softened the edges enough for new beginnings to grow. I imagined visits, small hands in the house, the sound of toys on the floor. Instead, distance remained, reshaped but intact. He sent money then too, envelopes addressed carefully, sometimes not carefully enough. When the wrong name appeared, I felt a quiet ache that surprised me with its sharpness. It was not anger, it was recognition. Relationships left unattended do not break loudly. They fade through small errors that go uncorrected. I tell myself my daughter has moved on. She has built something solid, something that does not depend on apologies or explanations. She sounds content when she speaks about her child, about her work, about her life now. And yet, when I listen closely, I hear the spaces between her words. They are wide. They hold things she has decided not to bring back with her. I wonder if one of those things is us. The invitation arrived without ceremony, slipped between advertisements and charity requests, its envelope thinner than I expected for something that carried so much weight. I recognized my daughter's handwriting immediately. It had not changed much over the years, still careful, still slightly slanted, as if she were always making sure her words did not take up more space than necessary. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it, not because I was afraid of what it might say, but because I was afraid of what it might make me hope for. It was a wedding invitation, simple, modest, her name printed clearly, confidently, as if she had learned how to stand fully inside herself. I read it once, then again. My hands trembled, only slightly. I told myself this was normal, that mothers always react this way. But beneath that familiar excitement was something more cautious, something that had learned to survive disappointment by lowering its voice. Still, hope does not ask permission. It rises quietly and waits to see if it will be acknowledged. I called her that evening. She sounded surprised that I had received it so quickly, as though she had not expected me to respond right away. We spoke politely, warmly even. She explained the plans, the small venue, the short guest list. I listened for something beneath her words, some indication that this invitation meant more than obligation. I did not find it, but I chose not to be discouraged. Sometimes beginnings sound ordinary. Sometimes they do not announce themselves. He was pleased when I told him. He nodded, smiled, said it was good to see her moving forward. He talked about what gift might be appropriate, about travel arrangements, about how nice it would be to see everyone together again. His tone was light, practical. I watched him closely, searching for signs of hesitation, regret, anything that suggested he understood the significance of this moment. I found none. That absence unsettled me more than anger would have. As the day approached, I prepared myself carefully, not just clothes and travel plans, but expectations. I reminded myself that weddings are not reunions, that they are not confessions, that my daughter did not owe anyone reconciliation simply because she was celebrating something new. I practiced restraint the way one practices a skill that has kept them safe for many years. I told myself I would follow her lead, that I would let her decide how much space she wanted to give. The ceremony was beautiful in a quiet way, nothing extravagant, just enough to feel intentional. When I saw her standing there, calm and composed, I felt a pride that surprised me with its steadiness. She did not look back toward us often. When she did, her eyes passed over quickly, politely, as if scanning a room rather than searching for connection. I told myself this was nerves. I told myself many things. Afterward, there was a reception. Conversations overlapped. Laughter rose and fell. I watched my daughter move through the room with ease, greeting guests, accepting congratulations. She seemed at home in her life, and I realized how little of that life included us. The realization was not sharp. It was dull, persistent, like pressure that builds without announcing itself. At one point, someone raised a glass. A speech was made, light-hearted, affectionate. Then another followed. I noticed the way my daughter's posture changed slightly as certain names were mentioned, certain stories shared. When it was his turn, he stood without hesitation. His voice carried well. He spoke of family, of forgiveness, of how proud he was of the woman she had become. The words were generous. They were also incomplete. I felt the room lean toward him, receptive, unaware of what had been omitted. I watched my daughter's face carefully. She did not react outwardly. She smiled when appropriate, she nodded at the right moments, but her eyes fixed on a point beyond the crowd, somewhere far away. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone who has learned how to endure without engaging. The speech ended to applause. He returned to his seat, satisfied. I remained still, my hands folded, unsure what had just been taken from her in the process. Later, I approached her quietly. I congratulated her again. I told her she looked beautiful. She thanked me. Her voice was calm, distant. We stood together for a moment that felt longer than it was. I considered saying something more, an apology, an acknowledgement, anything that might bridge the space between us. But the words did not come, or perhaps they did, and I did not trust them enough to let them out. As the evening wore on, I sensed a shift, not dramatic, not visible to others, just a subtle withdrawal. My daughter spent more time with her friends, less time circulating. When I caught her eye across the room, she smiled politely and looked away. I understood then that the invitation had not been an opening, it had been a boundary carefully maintained. She had allowed us to witness her life, not re-enter it. On the way back to the hotel, he spoke about how well everything had gone, how nice it was to see her happy, how time had a way of healing things if people were patient enough. I listened without responding. I thought of the speech, of the applause, of the way certain truths can be buried beneath pleasant words and still leave marks. I wondered whether my daughter had expected this moment to hurt, or whether it had surprised her too. That night, alone in the unfamiliar room, I lay awake thinking about the invitation, about what it had promised and what it had delivered. I realized that hope, once awakened, does not always lead to reconciliation. Sometimes it simply illuminates the distance more clearly. And in that clarity, I felt the first stirrings of something I could not yet name, a recognition that whatever silence had sustained us until now was beginning to change. After the wedding, something unsettled refused to return to rest. It was not anger. It was not even sadness in the way people usually recognize it. It was a quiet alertness, the kind that keeps you listening after a sound has already passed. I returned home and resumed my routines, but I noticed myself pausing more often, standing still in doorways, holding objects without using them. The house felt unchanged, yet I moved through it differently, as if I were now aware of every place where something had once been said and never corrected. My daughter did not call when she returned from her honeymoon. I did not expect her to.
I told myself she was busy, adjusting to a new life, learning the shape of shared days. Weeks passed, then months. When we spoke, it was brief and polite. She sounded well, tired but well. I asked about her child. She answered with careful warmth. I waited for her to mention the wedding again, to acknowledge the moment we had shared, but she did not. It occurred to me that for her, the event was already complete, filed away, its meaning settled. He spoke of it often, not with regret, with satisfaction. He repeated parts of his speech, adjusting them slightly each time, as though refining something he believed had landed well. He told friends how proud he was, how families go through difficult seasons but come out stronger if everyone learns to forgive. I listened from nearby rooms, my presence unnecessary to the narrative he was shaping. No one questioned him. No one asked how forgiveness arrives when it is never requested. The first time I realized something had broken quietly inside my daughter came through someone else. A relative mentioned, casually, that she had declined an invitation to a family gathering, no explanation given, just a polite refusal. I felt a small tightening in my chest, not because she had said no, but because I understood why she had not explained. Explanation invites debate, silence ends it. When I asked her about it later, she did not sound defensive. She said she was busy, that her schedule was full, that travel was difficult with a child. All reasonable things, all true enough to stand on their own. I told her I understood. I told her there would be other times. As I said it, I knew it might not be true. Understanding sometimes arrives too late to be useful. Another holiday came. Money arrived again in an envelope, this time addressed correctly. There was a note inside, friendly, brief, unsigned beyond a name. I held it longer than necessary, feeling the paper thin between my fingers. I thought of the way words had once been weighed and found insufficient. I wondered what an apology would look like now after so much time, whether it would still matter, or whether it had been rendered symbolic, an object without function. My daughter sent a message of thanks, short, courteous, final. I read it twice, then set the phone down. I realized then that she was no longer negotiating anything. She was not waiting for acknowledgement or repair. She was managing distance with the same efficiency she applied to the rest of her life. The realization carried a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief because there was no longer tension in her silence. Grief because there was nothing left to resolve. The breaking point did not arrive loudly. It came during an ordinary conversation, one that might have seemed harmless to anyone else. He mentioned her again, speaking about how strong she was, how the military had made her disciplined, successful. He said it with pride, as though her resilience were proof that everything had turned out fine. Something in me shifted then, slow but unmistakable. I saw the shape of the story he had been telling himself, one where consequences dissolved into outcomes, where pain justified itself by producing competence. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked him if he had ever apologized to her. The question hung between us, light and heavy at the same time. He looked at me surprised, then dismissive. He said there was nothing to apologize for, that she had made her choices, that time had passed, that bringing it up now would only reopen old wounds. I listened carefully. I heard certainty where reflection might have been, finality where humility could have lived. That night I could not sleep. I thought of my daughter at 18, standing at the door with a single sentence prepared. I thought of her at her wedding, listening to a speech that praised forgiveness without practicing it. I thought of her now, a mother herself, choosing distance not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I realized that what I had mistaken for healing was actually endurance, and endurance, while admirable, is not the same as peace. In the weeks that followed, I noticed changes in myself, small ones. I stopped passing along his messages immediately. I paused before mentioning family plans to her. I began to listen more carefully when she spoke, not for what she might need, but for what she had already decided. There was a steadiness there that told me she was no longer looking backward, that whatever hope I had carried since the wedding belonged to me alone. One afternoon, she called unexpectedly, not for a reason I could name, just to check in. We spoke about her child, about work, about ordinary things. Near the end, there was a pause, not uncomfortable, intentional. She said she was tired. I told her to rest. She thanked me. The call ended. I sat with the phone in my hand, aware that something had been said without words, a line drawn quietly, firmly. I understood then that the public moment at the wedding had not humiliated her in the way people usually mean. It had clarified something. It had shown her that acknowledgement was not coming, that repair was not being considered, that the story being told did not include her experience. And in that clarity, she had chosen herself. The understanding settled over me slowly, and with it came a recognition that whatever was coming next would not involve reconciliation. It would involve consequence.
Silence changes its character once you stop waiting for it to break. For a long time, I had treated the quiet between my daughter and the rest of us as something temporary, a pause that might end if the right words were spoken or enough time passed. After the wedding, that belief loosened its grip. The silence no longer felt like a space to be filled. It felt deliberate, maintained with care. I began to respect it in ways I had not before, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. My days settled into a steady rhythm. I woke early, I drank my coffee slowly, I tended to small tasks that gave shape to time. In the afternoons, I sometimes sat by the window and watched people pass, their lives intersecting briefly before continuing on. I thought of my daughter then, moving through her own days with similar purpose, her child anchoring her mornings, her work filling the hours in between. I imagined her competence, the quiet efficiency she had always carried, even as a girl. I realized she had not learned that from comfort, she had learned it from necessity. We spoke less often, but when we did, there was a calmness I had not heard before. She no longer sounded guarded, she sounded resolved. She told me about her routines, about her child's small milestones, about ordinary frustrations. She did not speak of the past. She did not speak of him. I did not ask. Asking would have implied an expectation she had already released. Our conversations were simple, and in their simplicity, they felt strangely balanced. He continued as before. He sent money, he mentioned her in conversation with others, he spoke of pride and distance as though they were compatible states. I listened without correcting him. Correction would have required energy I no longer wished to spend. Instead, I observed. Observation can be a form of preparation, though at the time I did not name it as such. I simply paid attention, noticing patterns, noticing how often he framed outcomes as proof that nothing needed to be addressed. There were moments when guilt pressed in unexpectedly, late at night usually when the house was quiet and the day's distractions had worn thin. I wondered if my daughter thought I had chosen a side. I wondered if my silence during the argument, during the years that followed, had felt like agreement. The thought unsettled me. I considered calling her to say something, anything, that might acknowledge my part in what had happened. Each time, I stopped myself. Words offered too late can feel like a demand for forgiveness, even when they are meant as acceptance. Instead, I began to listen differently. When she spoke, I noticed not just what she said, but what she did not correct. She did not soften her story. She did not seek validation. She stated facts plainly, the way one does after deciding what matters and discarding the rest. I recognized that tone. It was the same one she had used when she stood at the door years ago and said she was sorry. Clear, contained, final. I felt a quiet regret then, not just for what had happened, but for what had been misunderstood.
I also began to notice my own endurance, how easily I had mistaken it for peace. I had stayed, I had adapted, I had learned how to keep the household functioning without drawing attention to fractures. For years, I told myself this was strength. Watching my daughter now, I understood the difference. Endurance absorbs damage, peace requires distance from it. The realization was uncomfortable, but it settled into me with a kind of clarity that could not be ignored. There were practical matters, too, that demanded attention as time moved forward. Papers to sort, accounts to review, decisions that had been deferred because they were easier not to make. I approached them methodically without urgency. As I did, I became aware of how much had been arranged around assumptions that no longer held. Assumptions about family gatherings, about inheritance, about proximity. I did not act on these realizations yet. I simply noted them, the way one notes changes in weather that signal a season turning. My daughter mentioned once, almost casually, that she had learned to keep important documents organized after years of moving. She said it had taught her to rely on what could be proven rather than what was promised. The comment stayed with me longer than it should have. I thought of the ways promises had been implied rather than stated in our family, how expectations had been enforced without discussion. I wondered how different things might have been if clarity had been valued earlier. As weeks passed, a subtle shift occurred in my own sense of responsibility. I stopped feeling compelled to mediate, to explain one side to the other. I realized mediation assumes both parties are waiting for resolution. My daughter was not. She had resolved something privately without announcement. What remained was conflict, but consequence. Understanding this brought an unexpected sense of calm. It freed me from the role I had never chosen, but had performed out of habit. One evening, as I sorted through old files, I came across a photograph of my daughter as a teenager, standing in the doorway of the house, keys in hand, looking back at the camera with an expression I could not fully read. I sat with it for a long time. I saw now what I had missed then: the readiness, the restraint, the quiet acceptance of uncertainty. I placed the photo back where I found it, aware that memory alone does not grant permission to return. I did not yet know what form the coming change would take. I only knew that something was aligning, slowly, deliberately. My daughter had built a life that did not require revisiting old negotiations. I was beginning to understand what that demanded of me. Silence was no longer avoidance, it was acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, I felt the weight of choices made long ago pressing gently, insistently towards something that could no longer remain unexamined. By then, silence had become familiar enough that I could feel when it changed texture. It no longer felt like absence. It felt intentional, shaped by decisions made elsewhere. I carried that awareness with me through ordinary days, through grocery aisles and quiet mornings, through conversations that sounded normal on the surface but rested on altered ground. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything felt as though it were leaning towards something that had already begun. I started paying closer attention to details I had once ignored, not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility. There are moments in life when you realize that waiting is no longer neutral, that remaining still becomes a kind of choice. I did not speak of this to anyone. I did not name it even to myself at first. I simply allowed myself to notice patterns, to recognize how long certain things had been assumed rather than examined. My daughter called one afternoon while I was folding laundry. Her voice was steady, unhurried. She told me about a small challenge at work, something procedural, something that required patience rather than urgency. As she spoke, I heard how carefully she weighed her words, how precise she was about facts. She did not speculate. She did not complain. She described. I realized then that she had learned to move through systems that reward clarity and punish expectation. That understanding did not come from nowhere. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had recently reviewed some old records she kept from her years of moving. Housing documents, service paperwork, things she said it was good to keep even if you hoped you would never need them. Her tone remained light, conversational, but I felt something settle inside me, a quiet recognition that she had been preparing for her life without assuming support from anyone else. Not resentment, just realism. After the call ended, I stood there for a long time with a towel still in my hands. I thought about the ways I had organized my own life, the things I had put off because they felt uncomfortable to confront. It occurred to me that comfort had been allowed to guide too many decisions for too long, that ease had often taken precedence over fairness, not out of malice, but out of habit. In the weeks that followed, I began to sort through documents of my own, slowly, methodically, not with any single outcome in mind, but with a desire to understand what existed as it actually was, not as I had assumed it to be. I reviewed papers I had not looked at in years. Agreements that had once felt straightforward now revealed their silences. Names, dates, clauses that required interpretation. I did not rush. Rushing invites mistakes, and I had learned enough from watching my daughter to respect accuracy. He noticed my attention shifting, though he did not comment on it directly. He asked general questions, made small remarks. I answered neutrally. There was no need to announce anything. Announcements create resistance. I moved through my days calmly, maintaining routines, participating in conversations, listening more than I spoke. If he sensed something changing, he did not articulate it. Perhaps he believed stability was self-sustaining. Many people do. I thought often of the day my daughter stood at the door, how she had spoken one sentence and waited, how that sentence had been judged insufficient without discussion. The memory returned to me differently now, less as an emotional wound, more as a procedural failure, a moment where power had been exercised without accountability. The realization did not make me angry, it made me clear. Clarity is quieter than anger, but it lasts longer. There were moments when doubt tried to insert itself, late evenings when the house was still and familiar, when the weight of years pressed gently against me. I asked myself whether it was too late to change anything meaningful, whether acknowledging truth after so much time served any purpose beyond easing my own conscience. The questions did not demand immediate answers. They simply asked to be held without deflection. My daughter did not ask me for anything. That was perhaps the most telling part. She did not request explanations or apologies on my behalf. She did not suggest changes. She lived her life with the assumption that whatever she needed would come from her own efforts. There was a dignity in that which I admired deeply. There was also a quiet sadness, knowing how unnecessary that assumption might have been if things had unfolded differently. I began to understand that repair does not always mean reunion. Sometimes it means alignment. Sometimes it means making sure that the structures you are part of do not continue to reinforce harm simply because it is familiar. I did not frame these thoughts as plans. I framed them as responsibilities. Responsibilities do not require permission. They require attention. One morning, while reviewing a folder I had set aside weeks earlier, I noticed how easily my hands moved now. There was no hesitation, no confusion, just a steady sense of order. I thought of my daughter again, of the way she spoke about keeping records, about relying on what could be confirmed. I felt for the first time in years that I was approaching something with the same discipline she had been forced to develop so young. Nothing had been decided yet. Nothing had been revealed. Outwardly, life continued as it always had. Meals were shared. Conversations took place. Holidays were mentioned in advance, their logistics assumed. And yet, beneath that surface, something had shifted into alignment. Not dramatically, not visibly, but with the quiet certainty of something long overdue. I understood now that whatever came next would not be about punishment or reward. It would not be framed as correction or revenge. It would simply be the result of attention finally paid, of silence listened to rather than filled. And as that understanding settled in me, I felt a calm I had not known before, not because the past had been resolved, but because it was finally being addressed in the only way left available.
The truth did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as confirmation. By the time I understood the full shape of it, I realized I had been standing beside it for years, mistaking familiarity for permanence. The papers in front of me were not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no confrontations, no scenes that would have made sense to anyone watching from the outside. Just documents, dates, signatures, language that did not bend for sentiment. I had gone to the bank on an ordinary morning, intending to clarify something small, something administrative, the kind of errand people put off because it feels tedious rather than important. I sat across from a woman who spoke calmly, professionally, explaining what existed rather than what I believed existed. She slid copies across the desk, pointing where necessary, answering my questions without curiosity about why I was asking them now. To her, this was routine. To me, it was a quiet unthreading. I learned then how much had been assumed rather than agreed upon, how ownership had been structured, how authority had been interpreted. The house I lived in, the accounts connected to it, the decisions presumed to be shared were not as mutual as I had once believed. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden in the way people imagine secrets, just clarity where I had relied on trust and finality where I had leaned on habit. As I listened, I felt no anger. That surprised me. What I felt instead was a deep, steady understanding of how easily silence can be mistaken for consent. I had allowed years to pass without asking questions, because asking them would have required admitting uncertainty. I saw now how that same dynamic had shaped the moment at the door, the refusal to accept my daughter's apology because it did not arrive on prescribed terms. Control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits to be unchallenged. When I returned home, I did not say anything. I placed the documents where I could review them again later. I made tea. I watched the afternoon light move across the room. There was no urgency. Urgency suggests panic, and I felt none. I felt alignment. Pieces that had been floating separately had settled into a coherent shape. I understood now why my daughter had learned to rely on proof rather than promises. She had learned it in a house where language had once been used as a gate rather than a bridge. Over the following weeks, I took steps that required patience rather than courage. I consulted quietly. I asked questions without accusation. I made decisions grounded in fact, not emotion. Each action was small on its own, but together they formed a structure that did not depend on anyone else's interpretation. I did not announce these changes. I did not frame them as corrections. I treated them as what they were, long overdue acknowledgments of reality. He noticed eventually, not immediately. Changes like this rarely announce themselves until they alter expectations. A conversation ended differently than anticipated. An assumption met resistance where it once passed unchallenged. He asked questions then, his tone curious rather than concerned. I answered truthfully, briefly. I did not explain my reasoning. Explanation invites debate, and debate was no longer relevant. When he realized the implications, his response was not anger, it was disbelief. The kind that comes from assuming stability is guaranteed. He spoke of how things had always been done, of understandings that did not exist on paper but had lived in practice. I listened. I acknowledged his words without adapting them. Practices persist as long as they are unexamined. Once examined, they either adapt or dissolve. I thought of my daughter during those conversations, of how many times her reality had been dismissed because it did not align with expectation. I thought of her standing outside the house, her apology evaluated not for sincerity but for compliance. The connection was not metaphorical, it was procedural, a pattern repeated until someone chose to interrupt it. When the final documents were signed, I felt something close to relief, though relief is not quite the right word. It was more like completion, a sense that something unfinished had been brought to a natural close. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction beyond the quiet knowledge that alignment had been restored, however late. I did not call my daughter to tell her what I had done, not then. Actions like this do not seek validation. They stand on their own or they do not stand. I wanted the outcome to speak before the intention. Too often in our family, intention had been offered in place of accountability. I was careful not to repeat that mistake. The change became visible in subtle ways. Plans adjusted, expectations recalibrated. He spoke less about the future and more about the past, as people often do when certainty erodes. I did not argue with his memories, I allowed them their place. Memory, like silence, can coexist with truth without altering it. When I finally spoke to my daughter again, weeks later, I heard a difference in myself. Not confidence, clarity. I did not reference documents or decisions. I asked how she was. I listened. At one point, she paused as if considering something she might say and then choosing not to. I let the pause remain. Some things require evidence before they can be trusted. As we ended the call, she thanked me for listening. Just that, not for agreeing, not for understanding, for listening. The words settled in me with a weight that felt earned rather than assumed. I realized then that the truth, once aligned with action, does not need to be explained. It becomes legible on its own. What had been exposed was not a secret kept from others, it was a reality avoided by habit. And now that it had been faced, quietly and without spectacle, there was no way to return to the version of the past that had allowed the door to close so easily. The structure had changed, the silence had shifted, and whatever came next would unfold within that new, irreversible clarity. The aftermath did not announce itself with confrontation, it arrived through absence. Small changes accumulated, not as losses but as separations that no longer needed explanation. Conversations shortened, plans were discussed less often. The house remained the same shape, but it no longer carried the same expectations within it. I noticed this most clearly in myself. I stopped preparing defenses for decisions I had not explained. I stopped anticipating objections that were no longer mine to manage. He moved through the days with a carefulness I had not seen before. Not kindness, caution. He asked fewer questions, offered fewer assumptions. There was a quiet recalibration happening, though he never named it. People rarely name moments when control loosens. They adjust instead, hoping the shift will remain temporary. I did not reassure him. Reassurance would have implied uncertainty, and I felt none. My daughter sensed the change before I told her anything specific. She always had an instinct for that. When we spoke, there was a new ease in her voice, subtle but unmistakable. She did not ask what had happened. She did not inquire about details. She simply spoke more freely, as though something previously braced inside her had relaxed. I understood then that distance is not always measured in miles or words. Sometimes it is measured in pressure, and that pressure had eased. The first holiday after everything shifted passed quietly. There was no envelope sent in advance, no money, no note. I noticed the absence and let it remain unremarked. My daughter did not mention it. Her child's celebration unfolded with laughter and ordinary joy, shared with friends rather than extended family. I watched through photos sent later, noticing how present she looked, how unburdened. I did not feel excluded. I felt aligned with her choice. When I finally spoke to her more directly, I chose my words carefully. Not to persuade, not to justify. I told her that I saw her, that I understood more now than I had before. I did not ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness asked for too much too late. I told her that whatever distance she needed, I would respect. The words landed quietly between us. She did not respond immediately. Then she thanked me. Just that. No elaboration. It was enough. The separation that followed was not dramatic. He did not leave in anger. There were no accusations exchanged, no scenes that would have made sense to anyone watching. Instead, there was a gradual disentangling, decisions made independently, spaces redefined, roles relinquished without ceremony. We spoke when necessary, we were polite, but the partnership that had once relied on unspoken authority no longer existed. It had dissolved under the weight of clarity. I felt sadness then, but not regret. Sadness for what might have been different if acknowledgement had come sooner, if humility had arrived before distance hardened into structure. But regret implies an alternative still available. I no longer believed that. What existed now was consequence, and consequence is not something to mourn, it is something to accept. My daughter did not ask about him, she did not need to. Her silence on the subject was not avoidance, it was completion. She had already carried the weight of that relationship to its end long before I caught up. What remained between us was simpler, not healed in the way stories often promise, but honest. We spoke without navigating landmines. We listened without anticipating harm. There were moments when I missed the familiarity of my old life, the predictability, the way things had functioned without requiring examination. But that familiarity had come at a cost I was no longer willing to pay. I understood now that peace is not the absence of disruption, it is the absence of pretense. When people asked questions, I answered plainly. No details, no explanations. I did not feel compelled to protect anyone's image. Images matter less once truth has been faced. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was. People accept change more easily than we imagine when it is presented without drama. My daughter visited once, briefly, not for a holiday, not for an occasion, just a visit. She brought her child. We sat together in the quiet, watching the afternoon pass. There were no long conversations about the past, no careful negotiations of meaning. We existed in the same space without tension. I noticed how comfortable she seemed leaving when it was time. No hesitation, no obligation. That comfort told me more than any declaration could have. As she left, she hugged me gently. Not tightly, not desperately, just enough. I watched her walk away, confident in the direction she was going. I did not feel abandoned, I felt relieved. The separation had clarified what belonged to whom. Her life was hers, mine was mine, and between them there was respect rather than expectation. That night, alone, I sat with the quiet and recognized it as something new. Not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of endurance, but the silence that follows truth when it has finally been spoken through action. I knew then that whatever peace lay ahead would not come from reconciliation, it would come from freedom. Peace did not arrive the way I once imagined it would. It did not feel like warmth spreading suddenly through a cold room or relief that made me lighter overnight. It came quietly, in pieces, revealed through ordinary moments that no longer carried weight. I noticed it first in my mornings. I woke without bracing myself for the day. There was no sense of managing unseen tensions, no mental preparation for conversations that might turn sharp without warning. I moved through my routine with a steadiness that felt earned rather than forced. The house changed again, though this time I did not resist it. Rooms became what they were meant to be, rather than what they had once symbolized. I arranged things for function, not memory. Objects stayed where they were useful, not where they reminded me of something lost. This was not erasure, it was respect for the present. I understood now that clinging to the shape of the past does not honor it. It only prevents something honest from taking its place. My daughter and I settled into a rhythm that felt natural,
Not close in the way people expect mothers and daughters to be close, but clear. We spoke when we wanted to, not because it was required. When she called, it was because she had something to share, not because she felt she owed me reassurance. I listened without urgency. I responded without correction. Our conversations were not long, but they were real. They did not circle around old injuries. They rested on what existed now. Watching her with her child brought me a quiet sense of completion. She parented with intention, not fear. She set boundaries calmly, explained when explanation was useful, and allowed independence without punishment. I saw in her the absence of something that had once shaped her own young life. There was no conditional belonging in the way she loved, no doors that required the correct words to open. Seeing that did not make me proud in the way people usually mean pride. It made me peaceful. The pattern had ended. I did not think often of him anymore. When I did, it was without sharpness. I could acknowledge the good he had once done without feeling obligated to balance it against the harm. Both existed. One did not erase the other. That clarity felt like freedom. I no longer needed to defend my understanding or soften it for anyone else's comfort. The past had taken its place as something complete, not unresolved. There were moments when guilt tried to return, usually framed as questions about whether I should have acted sooner, spoken louder, interrupted more decisively. I allowed those thoughts to pass without argument. Regret assumes control over what was possible. I knew now that I had moved when I was able to move, understood when I was able to understand. That knowledge did not excuse delay, but it released me from punishing myself for it. Responsibility accepted does not require lifelong penance. My independence surprised me. I had not realized how much of myself had been organized around accommodation, around smoothing edges, around preserving stability at the expense of truth. Without that role, I discovered preferences I had not voiced before. I arranged my days to suit my own pace. I made decisions without consulting anyone else's expectations. It was not loneliness, it was autonomy. And autonomy, I learned, is not something only the young can claim. When people spoke to me about family, about forgiveness, about how time heals all things, I listened politely. I no longer felt compelled to agree. Time does not heal, it reveals. What people choose to do with that revelation determines whether healing is even possible. In our case, healing had not come through reunion or apology. It had come through separation, clarity, and respect for boundaries that should have existed from the beginning. My daughter never asked me if I regretted anything. She did not need that confirmation. What mattered to her was consistency, that my words matched my actions, that silence was no longer used as avoidance, but as space. Over time, trust grew, not dramatically, not declared, but steadily. It was the kind of trust that does not demand proof because it has already been demonstrated. I learned to value that kind of quiet more than any reconciliation story I had once imagined. There was no dramatic ending to our family's fracture, no final conversation that tied everything neatly together. Instead, there was a gradual settling into truth, a recognition of what could and could not be repaired, and an acceptance that some relationships end not with anger, but with understanding. Now, when I think back to the sound of the door closing all those years ago, it no longer echoes the way it once did. It exists as a fact, not a wound. I can hold it without tightening. I can remember my daughter standing there without wishing the moment undone. What followed was hard, yes, but it led her to a life defined by self-respect, and it led me, eventually, to the same. There is no reconciliation waiting in the future. I do not expect one. What I have instead is peace that does not depend on anyone else changing. I have a daughter who knows her worth, a grandchild who will never learn love as something conditional, and a life that finally reflects the truth I once avoided. That is not revenge. It is not victory. It is simply freedom.